bruised purple sky, a shroud over jagged peaks. The wind here didn't just blow, it bit, carrying the scent of ancient ice and the metallic tang of approaching blood. Qin Yan sat atop the lead wagon, her eyes narrowed against the grit. Beside her, Gung Feng held the reins, his knuckles white against the leather. He was a pillar of silent, weathered iron in this desolate landscape, his presence the only thing that felt grounded in a world that was rapidly dissolving into the chaos of war. "The air is changing," Gang Feng said, his voice a low vibration that barely carried over the rattle of the wheels. He looked at Qin Yan, his gaze lingering on the sharp, cold line of her jaw. "It's not just the cold. There's a weight to the silence up here." Qin Yan didn't look at him, but she felt the heat of his gaze. "It's the weight of an army, Gang Feng. The enemy doesn't hide in the shadows like the assassins in the capital. They march in the light, and they bring the end of the world with them." Behind them, Granny Lee was tucked into the furs of the second wagon, her face a map of worry but her spirit unbroken. She had followed Qin Yan from the parched earth of their village to the edge of the empire without a single complaint, her trust in her granddaughter absolute. But as they neared the military outposts of Kuguan, even her resilience was being tested by the sight of the refugees, thousands of them. A river of human misery flowing south, away from the smoke on the horizon. As they reached the gates of the border fortress, the live-in reality of the war hit them. The fort was a hive of activity, but it was the activity of a dying beast. Soldiers with hollow eyes and bandaged limbs leaned against the stone walls, their spears dull and their spirits broken. The famine hadn't stayed in the south. It had followed the army, and now the defenders of the empire were starving in their own trenches. Subi, who had been traveling with them in a state of quiet recovery, finally stood up. He was no longer the wounded man Qin Yan had dragged from a mountain cave. He stood tall, his armor pulled from the depths of Qin Yan's space, glinting with a lethal silver light. "I have to go to the command tent," Subi said, his voice regaining the resonance of a general. He looked at Qin Yan, a complex web of gratitude and something more mature and unspoken in his eyes. "If we don't hold the pass, there will be no Dawa village to return to. There will be nothing." "Go," Qin Yan replied. "I'll handle the supplies." The interaction was brief, but the tension was palpable. Gang Feng watched Subi leave, his hand tightening on his sword hilt. He knew that while he was the shield that protected Qin Yan's daily life, Subi was the sword that fought for her world. It was a silent, mature rivalry that didn't need words. That night, while the camp slept in the grip of a biting frost, Qin Yan moved. She didn't use a wagon or a team of mules. She walked to the edge of the granary, her silhouette swallowed by the darkness. With a silent ripple of the air, the space opened. It wasn't just a garden anymore, it was an arsenal. Ton after ton of grain, dried meat, and medicinal herbs flowed from the void into the empty bins of the fort. She used the spiritual spring water to lace the soldiers' water barrels, a secret tonic that would turn their exhaustion into a cold, focused fury. But the enemy had their own miracles. The martial god of the enemy country was not a man. He was a legend made of muscle and dark iron. He stood 7 feet tall, his voice a roar that shook the very foundations of the Kuguan walls. Beside him rode Princess Lanling, a woman whose beauty was as sharp and cold as the daggers she kept hidden in her sleeves. She was the architect of this invasion, a mirror to Qin Yan, a woman who moved the world with her will, but driven by a black, bottomless greed. The confrontation happened on the high ridges overlooking the pass. Princess Lanling had led a specialized unit to circle behind the fort, intending to burn the supplies she thought were still empty. She found Qin Yan instead. The two women stood on the edge of a sheer cliff, the wind howling between them. Lanling's silk robes whipped around her legs, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and hatred. "You," Lanling spat, her voice a shrill contrast to the roar of the wind. "The girl from the village, the one Mo Xuan protects. You think a few sacks of rice can stop the martial god?" "I don't think," Qin Yan said, her hand resting on the hilt of her iron blade. "I know. You came here looking for a famine, Lanling. You found a grave instead." The fight was visceral, a dance of steel and shadows on the edge of the abyss. Lanling was fast, but Qin Yan moved with the resonance of the space, her movements fluid and impossible to predict. The clash of their blades sent sparks into the dark air. In a final, desperate lunge, Lan Ling overextended. Qin Yan didn't strike to kill, she struck to end the threat. She stepped inside Lan Ling's guard and delivered a blow that sent the princess reeling. Lan Ling's foot caught on the loose shale of the cliffside. For a second, time seemed to stretch. She looked at Qin Yan, her expression shifting from rage to a pure, animal terror. Then, she was gone. The sound of her fall was swallowed by the wind, but the fall of a princess didn't stop a god. The martial god breached the outer gates at dawn. The air was thick with the smell of burning pitch and the screams of the dying. Su Bi met him in the center of the courtyard, the two men clashing with a force that sent shockwaves through the stone floor. Su Bi was a master, but the martial god was a force of nature. Qin Yan watched from the ramparts, her fingers itching to intervene. Geng Feng was beside her, his bow drawn, picking off scouts with a grim, rhythmic precision. "He's losing," Geng Feng whispered. "No," Qin Yan said, her eyes fixed on Su Bi. "He's waiting." She reached into the space and pulled out a single, glowing vial of concentrated spiritual spring essence. She didn't throw it. She used the teleportation function she had been honing in secret. The vial appeared in Su Bi's hand mid-swing. He didn't hesitate. He shattered it against his own blade, the liquid coating the steel in a brilliant, ethereal light. The next strike didn't just hit the martial god. It shattered his armor. The god fell, his legend ending in the mud and blood of the Kuguan courtyard. The victory was hollow, however, as long as the rot remained in the capital. The war at the border was won, but the war for the soul of the empire was just beginning. Qin Yan knew that Jilin, the Grand Secretary, and his daughter, Ji Haitong, would never stop. They would send more assassins, more forged decrees, more death. "We have to end it," Qin Yan said to Geng Feng as the sun rose over the blood-stained snow. "Whatever you need," he replied, his voice thick with a loyalty that had long since transcended the boundaries of a neighbor or a friend. The romance between them was finally out in the open, not in a kiss or a vow, but in the way he stood ready to follow her into the heart of the fire. The return to the capital was not a march, it was a ghost story. Using the teleportation of the space, Qin Yan bypassed the checkpoints and the guards. She arrived in the capital in the dead of night, a shadow among shadows. She found them in the Grand Secretary's manor. Jilin and Ji Haitong were celebrating, believing the news of the border defeat would surely include the death of Qin Yan and the prince. They sat among silks and gold, drinking wine that tasted of blood they hadn't spilled themselves. The teleportation was a silent rippling of the air in the center of the room. Ji Haitong froze, her wine glass slipping from her fingers and shattering on the marble floor. "You," she whispered, her face turning a ghostly white. Qin Yan didn't speak. She didn't need to. The mature, cold finality of her presence was enough. She looked at Ji Haitong, the woman who had sent killers after her grandmother, the woman who had tried to burn her alive for witchcraft. "I told you," Qin Yan said, her voice a low, terrifying calm. "The next body I found on my land would be yours. I just decided that all of the empire is my land now." She didn't use a blade. She used a rope, a simple, coarse length of hemp that smelled of the Dawa village dust. She strangled Jilin first, the man who had traded the lives of soldiers for a higher rank. Then, she turned to Ji Haitong. "Wait!" Haitong shrieked, her hands clawing at the air. "I didn't know you had a fiancé. If I had known you were with the prince, it wouldn't have mattered," Qin Yan interrupted. "Because you didn't kill me for the prince. You killed because you could. And now, you can't." The next morning, the manor was silent. The servants found them both, the Grand Secretary and the consort, strangled in their own beds, the marks on their necks a perfect match. Mo Xuan walked into the room an hour later. He looked at the bodies for a long time, his expression unreadable. He knew who had done it. He knew that the girl he had tried to protect had become the person who protected the empire. He walked out into the sunlight, the funeral for the Ji family already being prepared. The mysterious king's residence remained unaffected. The world continued to turn. Qin Yan stood on the outskirts of the capital, Geng Feng at her side and Granny Li safe in a new, quiet courtyard. The famine was breaking, the war was over, and the space was full of the seeds of a new beginning. She looked at the horizon, the jagged peaks of the north far behind her. The survival was over. The life was just beginning.